Hello, how's everyone doing? I hope you got some beverages, got some time to rest. Welcome back. We're continuing on with the program, and I'm very excited to introduce Ayana Contreras and Jacoby Cochran, who are here to have a conversation about the histories of gospel music. So we're continuing in the vein of things that Professor Adam Green spoke about in the cemetery, but moving beyond and past all of that as well. So Ayana Contreras is a cultural historian, memory worker, radio DJ, and archivist. An avid collector with over 10,000 vintage vinyl records for over a decade, she hosted the Reclaimed Soul program on Vocalo Radio and later on WBEZ in Chicago. She currently hosts Soulful Strut on Kuvo Jazz in Denver, Colorado, where she serves as VP of Radio at Rocky Mountain Public Media. A 2014-15 University of Chicago Arts and Public Life Artist in Residence, she's also a columnist for Downbeat magazine, and her writings have been published in the New York Times, Chicago Review, Oxford American, and Bandcamp Daily, among other publications. A contributor to the NPR Music New Music Friday podcast, in 2025, she served as a judge for the NPR Music Tiny Desk contest. Her book on post-civil rights era cultural history, titled Energy Never Dies, Afro-Optimism and Creativity in Chicago, was published December 2021 through University of Illinois Press. She's also going to be DJing after dinner, so I hope you'll all join us to dance. And as a DJ, she specializes in spinning all vinyl, rare groove, jazz, funky disco, and sample sets, and has DJ'd for the Vans Channel 66, Red Bull Music Presents, Gilles Peterson Presents, International Anthem on Worldwide FM, countless galleries, museums, and at venues in Los Angeles like Gold Diggers. Okay. I was like running out of breath at that point. She's also spun at residencies in Chicago at Dorian's, Pilsen Yards, Bronzeville Winery, and is a creative director for a DJ booth at the 95th Street Red Line CTA station. She's recently shared this stage with Roy Ayers, Micaiah McCraven, Nile Rodgers, and Chic, Duran Duran, and Gang of Four. And please put your hands together for Ayana Contreras. Will be Jacoby Cochran, who is a writer, storyteller, and educator from Chicago. He's also the host of the Moth Karaoke Storytellers and the award-winning CityCast Chicago, the city's #1 daily podcast for over 1,000 episodes. Please welcome Jacoby to the stage.
Thank you so much, Pranafi. Welcome, everybody. How are you all feeling this evening? Oh, y'all can do better than that. We in church. How y'all feeling? I was telling Ayana last time I was here, I was hosting a debate, a forum between the first congressional candidates back before Jonathan Jackson won. And there was about 45 candidates in here. And for me, it is really a testament of what a space like this has meant in this community. It is a place for us to come together in worship, but also a place to come together in political conversation, historical and musical discussions. And I'm so happy to be here with Ayana today. Ayana, can you tell us, I know we just had a very long bio, but
I told them they could truncate it if they needed to, but you know.
But can you tell us a little bit about, we're gonna talk in this conversation about some of gospel music's roots here in Chicago, but I think it'd be nice to start with our own personal histories and some elemental understandings of gospel music. And so I want to first kind of set the stage with your own personal history around gospel music. Can you remember your earliest memory, how long it's been a part of your life?
Let me put a pin in that for 2 seconds, only because you were just talking about this space. I actually talk about this space in my book in a very specific instance where Oscar Brown Jr. convened the Blackstone Rangers to perform right here. It was called Opportunity Please Not Chorus, which was trying to give them something positive to do so that they weren't hanging out in front of the Harper Theater and messing up his action, quote unquote, from his daughter. So it's really kind of cool to see this space in person and have a conversation like this. Anyway, so I just wanted to note that. I think in terms of gospel, growing up in a church that actually was founded at my house, it wound up being like in an actual building, was really, it was just a really big part of my life. And of course, music, I was always involved in, the gospel choir. Ultimately, in college, I toured in a gospel group in Japan for about a month. That is not in the bio. That's for these years only. So it's something that's very close to me. But I think in terms of how I understand it as a cultural historian, I really understand it more in terms of how in Chicago the gospel legacy is inextricably linked with other musical traditions, specifically Black music traditions. It's for me, very difficult to pull them away from each other because there's so much overlap in terms of the players and the people who love this music, so.
Yeah, I grew up in different neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago, one of which was right off of 66 and Greenwood. And so I walked past the Oakwood Cemetery every single day, mostly to go to the corner store where any dollar I would get would immediately go back there for like zebra cakes and like pounds of Fruities. I didn't know right across the way there was such historical significance, such cultural landmarks in Black Chicago's history. But for me, I grew up in a time in which white flight had already removed most of the white people from the south side of Chicago. And so even though I grew up going to an all-Black Catholic school, I still grew up in the traditions of Black gospel music. And so even as I grew up to come to understand sort of different religious communities, different religious sects, members of my family attended Lutheran church or Baptist church or Protestant. And I think the one thing that separated us was more about how much time we spent in church, but there was never any division as it related to gospel music. And so for me, it was as simple as the first Black music I ever came in contact with. And so I didn't feel any strong sense that it was separate from other forms of Black music. At that time, hip hop had already been brought into gospel music, blues, jazz, which were seminal in its modernization in Chicago. And so it wasn't until I became an adult that I started to really see it for its uniqueness, to better understand where it fit into the broader traditions of Black music. And so one of the things I want to ask you is, what are some of the elements that are maybe not unique to gospel music in the sense that you won't find them in any other genre, but are really the markers of that is gospel music besides sort of the religious messaging? So
I want to be clear, I am not a gospel music expert, TM. But, because I don't want the gospel police to come get me. But what I will say is when we talk about gospel music, a lot of the times we're kind of conflating a lot of different spiritual musics. But gospel music as we know it, when we talk about Thomas Dorsey being the father of gospel music, we're talking about a very specific branch of like spiritual music that actually combines what you would think of as a devotional hymnal sort of tradition, but actually adds in jazz roots, adds in blues licks, adds in a lot of different things, and now has added in soulful elements, more like contemporary elements. It's just a little bit more. I like to mention, my friend R. Young likes to say that it's somewhere in that alley between where the devotionals were sung and the blues were wailed. There's that in-between place. I will also note that even though we've talked about sort of the connective tissue between the musics, I've also always been very clear about the difference between the secular, right, the sacred and the versus the profane, right? Like there is always that difference. That's something we have to mention. But again, I just think it's very interesting when you look at even the liner notes of some of these records, like who played on these records. And even to this day, a lot of my dear friends who play jazz music, play different types of music, also play in the church on Sundays. So it's really difficult to draw a hard, fast line between all of these different musical traditions that have come together to birth this thing we're calling gospel.
Yeah. I think what was cool is when I was coming up, and I imagine this for generations before, but like any person that I knew who played an instrument played that instrument in church. Like any singer in my school or in my neighborhood who had any type of raw talent, they formed and honed that talent in church. I still remember my older brother who, when I was in the 6th grade, I starred in my school's rendition of the Passion Play, which of course is the trial, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. My brother starred as Jesus Christ. And of course, being the little brother, there was only one role that I could take, and that was of Pontius Pilate. But watching my brother, who is now someone who does spoken word, who does R&B, who does hip hop music, you know, he, like so many of the people I grew up around, honed those gifts inside of the church. There was such musical scholarship built into our choir that I didn't realize in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade that I was learning traditions of jazz music and jazz rhythms, that I was learning the traditions of like blues construction and blues melodies. God rest his soul, my music choir director his name was Mr. Carter. And he was someone who really lived in the traditions of those like Thomas Dorsey, who he would take the Catholic hymns and he would absolutely remix them. He would take the dialogues and the monologues of the Passion of the Christ and he would turn them into these gospel ballads in a way that I, again, had no appreciation as a child. For me, that was just like black sauce. That's just what we did. You could take something that was maybe subdued, and you could bring the energy to it. But then you track that back, right? As I come older and I start to learn these histories, even though we may start this modern lineage in Chicago and with Dorsey, one of the great things about Chicago is so much of our legacy is the legacy of the Great Migration, is the legacy of the Mississippi Delta and Louisiana and Arkansas and Alabama, and these people bringing these great traditions. And I want to sit there for a second because you talk about how gospel music is different than some of this older devotional music, some of the, we talk about the revolutionary act of slave hymns being performed out in, right outside the ear of the big house. But can we talk about how some of those elements are brought into early gospel music and talk about maybe that tradition of like taking the subdued, taking the hymn, and just putting the African diaspora on top of it?
It's so interesting because I think when we're talking about this tug, between the church and the world, right? There was a lot of artists that in that migration, they brought both sides of themselves with them, right? We talk about Thomas Dorsey, right? Comes from Georgia, comes to Chicago, and tries to make it as basically a blues and jazz artist, and ultimately wound up at Pilgrim Baptist, where he was the music director for I think something like 50 years. But it wasn't a smooth line,
right?
You know what I'm saying, to get to that point. But what he learned in the barrel house, so to speak, were some of the things that he was also bringing into the music that he was doing. He wanted to have music that spoke to people who maybe were not in the pews, or maybe they were in the pews on Sunday and somewhere else on Saturday, right? Like, let's talk about it, right? I'm thinking right now, we're going a little off of Chicago topic, but I was watching the Clark Sisters Unsung. Has anybody seen this? Yeah, right? It's so good, isn't it? Anyway, I was watching that, and there's a point when they have this international smash, You Brought the Sunshine. big record. They cut a disco single and everything, and they were being offered to play at Studio 54 at any price. Now, keep in mind, their mother was a high-ranking Church of God in Christ, like, elder person, like, very important person. And so, like, this was considered, like, really taboo. Like, you can't play in, like, a club if you are sanctified. You see what I'm saying? And I said to myself, and this is because you know I was non-denominational, I was not Kojic. So I said to myself, isn't that where you should be, performing the gospel? Like, making people feel good with positivity and, like, a message that tells you that there's a higher being out here who has your back, who can really take you through to the next level of your life, right? But that wasn't it. So that's the end of my soapbox. But I think in general, like, when you listen to what Thomas Dorsey was doing, he was doing what Kirk Franklin was doing, right? He was taking something, a message of upliftment that belonged in more than just the pews, more than just in the homes of Christian people. And I think that's a really powerful legacy that we kept seeing happen over and over and over again. But Thomas Dorsey was one of those people who really, really just kicked it into another notch.
Yeah. I think the evolution of gospel music, even if we're going prior to, like, the genesis of this term, because we live in a term now where it's so mainstream and we know it, but it wasn't a term that even, during Dorsey's time was one that people so readily used, right? Sometimes in some places it was taboo. But what I find interesting is, like, even if we go hundreds of years earlier to plantations in which people are being indoctrinated into Christianity, one, as a way to try to kind of break this resilience that is still at place in enslaved Africans, who without language, the language of their enslaver, without also maybe a common language with some of the people alongside them, there was still this music, this spirituality that they kept inside of them, and that they would showcase in rhythm, in song, in resistance. And this early indoctrination of Christianity was often a way for the enslaver to try to take out this spirit, to try to assimilate them all under a much more subdued tradition. And yet it could not break them. And yet that even as new generations of individuals were born fully under the doctrine of Christianity, decades in, they still found a way for their tradition to come to the surface. They still took these hymns and these verses, and they still put rhythm on top of it, syncopation, call and response on top of it, and all the way up to the point that church leaders once again tried to stamp this out of Black church. And as you come, decades down the line towards Reconstruction, post-Emancipation Proclamation, as people are in that first wave migrating to Chicago, you see once again them being told, you need to leave those traditions behind. You need to leave the instrumentation behind. You need to leave the call and response, the participation behind. And so I give this long history because I grew up in an era in which when you say Black church, you typically mean 2 or 3 things. You mean extremely participatory music, right? Testimonial, the audience participates, the choir participates, the preachers participate. You often mean a little bit longer, right? There is room for improvisation. There's room for people to be called to the moment. And then 3, you're often thinking about like a history of oration. But what's so interesting is as we talk through this history, these are 3 things that time and time again, people try to stamp out. They try to get rid of. When the Dorseys, the Mahalia Jacksons are coming up from Georgia and New Orleans, they're bringing these traditions that predate the moniker of gospel music, and they are not welcomed. You talk about this battle between secular music and gospel music, but there was an internal battle in terms of religious music that when Southerners were coming up here with this tradition of testimonial, of group participation, they were introduced to these silk stocking churches, right, which in many cases anchored the South Side of Chicago. Can we talk a little bit about this tradition that is both of Black folks and of Black music, but even at times was challenged inside of the Black church?
So it's interesting because you're kind of touching on a couple of different points. I'm not going to get too much into the class-based struggle that was also happening with those situations, but Chicago was a very different city when Thomas Dorsey arrived in 1919, right? Like, it was not a majority-minority city at that time. My family goes back really, really far. On one side, we came up on the Underground Railroad to outside of Chicago, and on the other side, we were in the neighborhood before the Black Belt was called the Black Belt, which is where all the people of color kind of were. It's kind of, now it's where a little bit of Taylor Street-ish, Chinatown-ish, like it was just this kind of brown place. And that included Italians. So everybody was together. But in order for Black people, in some ways, to be accepted, there was a lot of assimilation that had occurred for those very early people who had come up before the big Great Migration. And I'm not making excuses, I'm just saying culturally that's what it was.
Yeah.
So they were thinking, they were putting people on game, like, you can't do all that. You have to put that away and perform in this way in order to be accepted. But, I mean, spirit is irrepressible, right? Like, you're going to worship your God in the way in which you see fit, and eventually, you get to the point where there's just this huge influx of people and culture, and it changes the way the Black city is even functioning. Yeah. Which I think is beautiful. I mean, it happened again with the second wave, right? Like, completely different, whole group of people, again, influx Southern culture into Chicago. To this day, where was I? I was someplace, and I was talking to this cat from Mississippi, and he's like, "Oh, where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Chicago." And he's like, "Oh, yeah, that's like Mississippi North." I'm like, "We say that too." I'm so happy that that's still
100%.
a thing that people say, so.
Yeah, my family is also split between individuals who came up from Louisiana and Mississippi during the sort of second wave of the Great Migration. I have great-grandparents who came during the 30s, the 40s. And like you say, in that early wave of that migration, there is this impetus on respectability, but it comes out of a desire to survive. Right? You talk about 1919, this is like the year of the Red Summer.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? This is like race riots and burning people's homes down and pushing them out of neighborhoods. And so when we talk about this tension, it is one that, like you say, is one that we have to, both complicate but also approach with empathy. Because the people who were here for decades, who we will not completely let off the hook for the classist ways in which they maybe turned away from their brothers and sisters who came up during the 20s and 30s to say, actually, it's not just that you are rambunctious in the church, it's actually the way you dress, the way you eat, the way you move through the city. It's something that we want you to unlearn. But again, despite that, the not only the wave of people who come up, but this music eventually takes. Like there is this pressure. I feel like we were talking about this before we got here. I've never seen a biopic about a famous Black singer, whether it's Aretha Franklin, Ray Charles, where there isn't a moment where they're told, you got to choose between devil's music and the Lord's music. It's like every biopic, there is a moment in which that conversation is had. But what is clear is, at least during this time, it doesn't end up being one or the other. Eventually,
some people choose.
No, of course. Eventually, some people choose. But can we talk about like that merging? I think about, and again, we mentioned Dorsey, but I think we need to talk about Sally Martin and Magnolia Butts and Willie Mae Ford and Roberta Martin and Mahalia Jackson. These women who ultimately probably are the catalysts who see the vision through, whose sound is able to really merge again, what's happening on Saturday and what's happening on Sunday, in a kind of undeniable way that takes gospel music from, again, this lineage of the back house to the storefront church, essentially globally.
Right. That's like a really long story, and I am not an expert. Remember, we said this. But what I will say is, yeah, I mean, Roberta Martin was one of the trusted voices for the vision of Thomas Dorsey, for instance. And Mahalia Jackson is really interesting because I would argue that she is the one that really was the Michael Jordan, we'll say, of Chicago gospel music, in the sense that she was able to just really cross over into spaces and places that a lot of her predecessors had not been able to do.
Starting as a teenager.
Right. But I mean, in terms of when she really became internationally renowned outside of the Black community, I would say early 1950s was when that started, when she was signed to, what's the name of that label? I can picture it. It's got the lady. What's the name of that label? Somebody knows. Anyway, she was signed in Precious Lord Take My Hand, which was the recording that was a recording of Thomas Dorsey's writing, was really an international hit. And she was singing in at jazz concerts and festivals and all of this, which again goes to that idea of, oh, you can't sing that music someplace else. But at the same time, she was enriching people's lives in ways for people that never would have walked through the doors of a church on the south side or west side of Chicago. So like this album is probably, let me see, I'm gonna pull it out, the very first album that had any real gospel things that I really connected to. And it's gonna sound weird to you because I'm not, I was born in the 80s, but this is Duke Ellington and his orchestra featuring Mahalia Jackson, Black, Brown, and Beige. This was my great-grandmother's record. Powerful.
Can we talk about some of the records in your collection and like maybe what you plan on playing a little bit later, and talk about the era that represents? Because a lot of people, when they talk about the history of gospel music, they will really lean into that Great Migration, 1930s, 40s, and then it feels we like hit 2x speed, 3x speed, and just kind of...
And all of a sudden it's Mary Mary.
Yeah.
It's interesting, right? Yeah, because, okay, so for me, if anybody knows anything about kind of what I do, I'm really into 60s, 70s specifically, like, and with some peripherals around that, but those are the two decades that I'm really interested in musically, culturally, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that's kind of where I was always, as I'm like digging in crates and exploring records, I'm looking at, oh wow, these are the same people who are on these records that I love so much, by Earth, Wind, Fire, let's say. Oh, look at that, they played for, you know, the Operation Breadbasket Choir. This is amazing. Or this other person who, you know, did work for, actually he played with the Rolling Stones. Oh, he also played on this album. Like, it's crazy. But I think in general, I'm just, it makes a lot of sense, ultimately, because what the roots of what they learned, they were able to translate into lots of different paradigms. I've interviewed a lot of folks from that particular era, where they really started out in that era, we'll say. And one of the things that they continuously have told me is they don't think about genre. They think about the music being like this font, right? Like this river of creativity that started before them and ends after them, and it cannot be broken by like some sort of delineation of genre. So I'm always interested in that. So I'm going to be playing some of that type of stuff, but I'm also going to be playing some of those records that I feel like were hits. You know, some Reverend Clay Evans, some, you know what I'm saying, some Stanley Keeble, like some music that people really loved, you know, at that time. I'm not really trying to get super, super, super obscure with it. I want to bring joy, you know, happiness.
As you were talking through that...
But it's not a dance party. Because I heard some rumblings of a dance party. I mean, you could dance, but that's not the goal. The goal is to feel uplifted.
All right, I'm fashioning this kind of question conversation point in real time, so kind of bear with me. Because we talk about like this relationship between Chicago and gospel music. which of course is always this relationship between the now and the before times, right? This Southern tradition. But when I think about like Chicago and in the contemporary, there's this narrative, whether true or not, that people cut their teeth in Chicago and then they leave us, right? They cut their teeth in comedy or news or in industry, maybe finance or, even maybe, academia, right? They cut their teeth here and then they leave. And you talk a lot about some of these artists who, they may have got their formal training in the church and gospel music and gospel tradition, but they may be known, or Aretha Franklin, for example, but they may be known, as the queen of soul or R&B or pop music. Does Chicago and gospel music share this sort of maybe reductive narrative of places or genres that people may get their training in, but then they ultimately leave for R&B or pop or New York City? Are those is that a fair line of thinking of Chicago and gospel music, or is that, even in my own setup, or is that a reductive way of thinking about it?
I don't think historically speaking, I don't think so. And I say that because there are definitely people who started out in the church and then just left the church. But I think more often than not, what I was seeing was people who started out in the church, started a kind of like side career, sometimes under a different name. No, I'm just saying it like it was, in the non-gospel space. And then we're simultaneously still producing gospel recordings. That's the thing about it that's really interesting. There's a lot of people who were doing both simultaneously. At least in terms of producers and people who played on records, like Morris Jennings, for instance, an incredible chess drummer, played on all sorts of recordings, sacred and blues and this within a month's time. You know what I'm saying? Like, they did not necessarily, especially the musicians, didn't necessarily have to choose.
I think when we have this conversation, it's very easy for us to talk about like Black gospel music as a seminal art form in our households, in our community. But do you think whether even across this timeline of maybe 90, 100 years we've covered, did it ever, right, we mentioned Mahalia Jackson going international, but as a genre, did it ever break past Black community and become a chart topper, a exalted genre in sort of just the American musical history?
Well, I mentioned the Clark sisters, right? Like, that was a huge record, like a pop huge record. I think that there have been records that have made it to the top of Black music, right? Like, they were played, they were crossover, they wound up playing on R&B and hip hop stations. That has happened. I think I'm gonna get like real inside baseball here. As a radio person, I think that Black radio kind of not really trying to push blues music, jazz music, and gospel music to the peripherals was really detrimental to those genres in terms of their ability to get the level of exposure that soul music and later hip-hop music was able to get. Because in the beginning, those stations played everything. Like WVON played everything. And then, as time went on, it started to become just on Sunday mornings, or just on Saturday nights, or just over here on the corner, or then sometimes not at all. And that also made it harder for younger generations to be introduced to the music unless they were in the church themselves or somehow involved with jazz or somehow involved with it. So they became niche in a way that they weren't previously, right? Now, obviously, radio is not the arbiter of music in the way that it was. It's not as influential, but the damage, I think, has been done in terms of people's general knowledge, like Black people's general knowledge of the music, and as we know, black people are tastemakers for other people. So if we're like really saying this is a new hot thing, suddenly, starts leaching into into other cultures as well. you know. So I don't know. I mean, I think about that a lot because I know how I was really formed in spaces outside of gospel was really through the radio. Because what I was really hearing in my everyday life was mostly contemporary gospel music, you know. So, like, if I hadn't had radio, that I wouldn't have been as well-rounded. And I think a lot of people were the inverse of that.
Yeah. I mean, had I not had Mr. Carter, because by the time I was coming off, it was already segmented to Sundays or like a special broadcast time. It wasn't sort of...
Or AM on the dial, which is like...
Yeah, it wasn't funneled and kind of fused into the broader playlist. You know, I know we're kind of jumping across time, but do you think in I don't want to say its own undoing, but there was this feeling that like gospel music was a thing that at a certain point you could define, you could hold, and as it starts to commercialize, as it becomes, you know, more of a commodity versus a musical tradition in a very specific place with a very specific group of people. How do you think maybe the broader commercialization of gospel music and the need to make a profit off of gospel music, and you kind of talk about that in some of the ways the radio pushes it, but how did the commercialization of gospel music, the push to get a hit, you know, in some ways become its own undoing as well?
I don't know. I don't think. I think that the more people who hear gospel music, the better off we are as people. I personally think that. I think that the commercialization of it, you could talk about stylistically how it's become less delineated from, like, you know, more clearly, like contemporary gospel is less like gospel and more like soul or more like R&B or more like this. I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just a different thing, you know. I mean, now we've gone so far that a lot of these Christian stations, you turn them on and you can't tell whether it's Christian or not until they say, Ecclesiastes. I'm like, wait a minute, hold on. what did you just say?
I definitely don't want to like haphazardly or accidentally create the very same dynamic and binary that we talked about throughout. Because again, I grew up in the Yolanda Adams, in, you know, Steele, Shirley Caesar, but also
Donnie McClurkin.
Kirk Franklin was in my like classrooms, like make me wanna, like he. Oh yeah, I was like, I didn't know the difference between.
But you know, that's a
Kirk
sample
Franklin
of like Funkadelic, right? Like he admits it. He admits it. Like.
Right, so I grew up watching a sort of new wave of kind of crossover music and watched as the same argument was happening. It was like, is that real gospel music? And so I'm not arguing that it's broadening out, it's sort of becoming more shapeless in genre is a bad thing, but I'm wondering if there is credence to that argument.
I mean, I think there's room under the sun for all of it, right? Like, I just think that. And maybe I don't want to be the voice of it, but I will say from my perspective, I think that there's space, and maybe I'm sensitive, again, coming from a non-denominational church where we were singing, you know, like very, very, like, I don't know, not gospel, and we didn't have like a big gospel choir, like the mass choirs, because I grew up in the era of the mass choirs. We didn't have anything like that. We had a praise team, you know. Somebody out here knows what I'm talking about. It was just a very different paradigm. But we also had Jesse Dixon, who came to our church every year and performed, and we had a lot of, you know, those sorts of artists pop in. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, like I said, I'll just reiterate. I think any way in which someone chooses to, you know, connect with their God, I think is beautiful.
If someone were to ask you then, what is modern gospel music? Would the records that you reach for and you talk about, would they be of the last 20 years? Or with that idea of modern gospel, is that still a, not timeless, but does that still play back to the 60s and 70s for you? Or is that something new in the 60s to the 90s that is its own genre?
So I'm going to use art terms here because in art terms, modern does not mean now. Modern is talking to a specific time period, really very conveniently, the time frame that I'm talking about when I'm talking about this music. Now, contemporary would be in our times right now. So I think that's just like a very different thing. I think modern gospel music, for me, would be like that 50s classic period with the quartets, and to your point, the individual women with accompanistness and those styles, and then into the 60s and 70s where you started to get those choirs and you started to get the more soul-based recordings and even funky type stuff, and Andre Crouch and the Holy Roller Disco, that's what I call it, where he's like really like, you know, rocking those pews. I think all of that, I feel that that's kind of like that modern era, and then it really went contemporary in a whole nother level. But what I think is so interesting about the contemporary gospel music is it's so rooted in jazz and has some very specific licks that to this very day, if I hear a new group playing, I'll be like, oh, gospel chords, I can hear it. I can hear those gospel chords, because it's still permeating. I mean, it's still very, I don't know, it's still in the music. Mm-hmm. It's just, you have to look a little harder when you're talking about the non-secular music today.
Mm-hmm. As a music historian, as someone who, as you both are always celebrating the past, but I imagine have your kind of ear on like where sound is going and what trends are. I'm gonna hodgepodge a lot of things in here, but like to be talking about Chicago's relationship to gospel music, which is ultimately to be talking about Black Chicago's relationship to religiosity, the religious traditions of Chicago, to be having this conversation at a moment in which, even though it's the Catholic tradition, everyone's talking about a pope being from the south side of Chicago and being from Dalton.
You're waiting for him to say that one part too, right?
Which part? The Dalton?
No, his background. That part. Yes.
Oh, right, right. Also a conversation about the Great Migration, right? This relationship between the South. But I wonder, I bring all that to say, it feels like there has been a resurgent conversation around Chicago and religiosity, which will then lead us into a conversation about Black Chicago and gospel music. Do you think this moment where, you know, Christian rappers are getting more attention, where again, we're having a conversation about Chicago's relationship to like the religious traditions, do you see maybe an opening for I don't want to say resurgence, but maybe just a deeper appreciation for whether it's contemporary or modern or even just the larger roots of gospel music, whether in Chicago or broader?
I really hope so. Mm-hmm. I mean, like, I'm not here, like, I was going to say I'm not here in a bully pulpit, but here we are. But what I was going to say is, like, I mean, personally, I'm always a champion for those musics that are not being centered right now in the conversation about Black music in the way that they should be, because they're just so important. And I don't even want to just say influential because it makes it sound like it's in the past. I'm talking about important today. So again, jazz, blues, and gospel, to me, I say those in the same breath as soul, because I think that all of those things are so much of who we are as people. And then you put in hip hop, and then you put in house, and then you put in all of these other things that are branches of those roots. I hope so. I think that there's a piece of us missing when we don't recognize the spirituality that got us to where we are, and that we're going to need to get us out of what we're in.
I wasn't even going to take it there, but I was going to ask. But I mean, we've watched this music be the soundtrack, again, whether we are talking about the definitive or the attempts to create brackets around gospel music, or even just talking about this history of Black music in the Americas. Right. It is a music that is inextricably linked to struggle, to overcoming, which is to say Blackness in the Americas is inextricably linked to struggle and resilience. But I wonder, at a time in which we are being, I think, on a particularly driven by economic, political pressures to give away community, to be more individual, to think about our own households and our own personhood.
Who does that? I don't know. I mean, we're in different circles.
No,
so.
I'm simply saying the politic and the economic time, the narrative of our time is one that wants to individualize us.
I got it. Okay.
To think about our own time, and yet this broader tradition of black music is one of community and of celebration. So in this moment in which the pressures of neoliberalism in our economy are trying to make us more divisive to one another, more isolated from one another, what role do you think not just gospel music, but again, inherently black music plays in sort of maintaining those bonds of community?
He's really hitting me with some real deep questions, right? I mean, I guess I say all the time, I come from the school of we rather than me. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? And I think that goes back to this concept of, we being really important. I mean, yes, your individual relationship to God, right? But a lot of gospel is a collective cry out, a collective cry for, making it through and overcoming and empowering each other. Like, telling someone, if you confess the Lord, call him up, right? And tell him what you want. That's someone telling you and encouraging and feeding into you what you can do to help yourself out of a circumstance, right? So I think in general, one of the things that is really important to me is making sure that if I'm playing music that makes people feel like something is possible. I'm not trying to bring people down or make them think that something that, you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Just because it's, and this goes back to my book, you notice I haven't mentioned the name of the book because I'm not trying to plug it, but.
Energy Never Dies.
Stop,
There's
no.
a CityCast Chicago episode where we sat down, talked through the book.
I'm only saying it
amazing.
Because I wrote it for this exact reason, right? I wanted to give people stories of people who had done something beautiful, right? But what folks might not know is I got some people who gave me kind of flack about that, about even just using the term Afro-optimism, because it wasn't realistic, and we shouldn't, you know what I'm saying? That's not real. And some other people even said things like, well, everything she brings up doesn't exist anymore. Thank you. Thank you. Someone in the audience said, well, you just said energy never dies. Correct. Right. I mean, the title of the book comes from my grandmother. See, I don't know if any of you have ever been to one of my talks. I always cry. So this is about to be the time. Every time.
Somebody told a story last night at karaoke about their grandmother, and I sat there bawling the entire time.
But anyway, so the title. So my grandmother, we were at her kitchen table in Chatham, whole family, and she tells us she has stage 4 cancer. And she's not upset, I'm not upset, because she lived her life, right? And so my aunt, she goes, why aren't you all upset? Why aren't you mad? This is horrible, this is terrible. And my grandmother goes, energy never dies. So I say all that to say, if you talk about something that isn't in front of you, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. You know what I'm saying? So the whole purpose of gospel music is to take you through, even if you can't see tomorrow, to know that there is something better for you out there, which is what the whole point of all of it is. And if you don't have that, in a moment like this, I don't know what else to wish for someone to have. And we could get into conversations about who is this God, who is Jesus, who are these people, but I'm a person who believes that I feel this power in everything I see, in all of the creation. I believe in that. So when we're in this type of conversation, it's all about belief, right? It's not about facts. I'm not an expert. I just know what I know, and I know that here, and I know that here. And this music speaks to that.
I appreciate you for that.
I'm sorry. I was really trying hard. When I had my other record with my grandmother, I was like,
No, I sat with very similar thoughts last night after listening to the story of someone told of their grandmother and what they gave them. And I published a story a few years ago called Time Traveler. And it's about sitting in my grandmother's home, which for most of my family was our church. Of course, we had our home parishes. My grandmother had her home parish, but, that is where we gathered sort of in the name of family, legacy, and the Lord. And so for us, that was our place of worship. And she, in many ways, was our link to a history and a legacy. And it's not much a question, but I wonder, for me, it's something I've had to and continue to struggle with following her death. There's this Kendrick Lamar lyric where he basically says, all my grandmothers are dead, so who will pray for me? And it stuck with me because throughout my life, I lost all of my grandmothers, by the time I was in my early 20s. And for me, they felt like jazz music in flesh, and blues music, and African storytelling, and gospel music in flesh, because you walk in their home and they exuded it, right? Whether one grandmother who lived on 87th and Sangamon, literally across the street from Mahalia Jackson Elementary School, who had white Jesus in her home, and my grandmother who lived off of 87th and Stony Island, who had black Jesus in her home, the music was the exact same. The conversation and the storytelling was so similar. And to be honest, growing up in the 90s and the early 2000s at a time in which the world is trying to shout to you that we're fast approaching a post-racial society, right? A utopia, the realization of our ancestors, like wishes and dreams. I took for granted how my grandmothers represented a deep connection to these black legacies, and when they passed, I had not yet come into an appreciation for what they gave me, what they connected me to. And so for me personally, their deaths felt like the death or the abandonment of blues music and jazz music and gospel music. And though I personally held tight to storytelling, what felt like the last remnants of them being here, a part of me has felt like I am still searching for these, I'm sorry for the term, but these horcruxes of their existence. And for me, it feels like gospel music and jazz are those things that when I listen to them, I feel reconnected to them. And so I'm wondering, what can we do, even if it is not in this contemporary sense, like taking jazz and blues and gospel to the top of the charts? How do we continue to use them as a connective tissue to both ancestors long gone and legacies long gone, but legacies and ancestors who never died and could never die and have got transferred to us? How do I take up that mantle and that responsibility with these genres?
I mean, I really think, you're really speaking my language, because this is what my whole ministry is, right? I think in terms of understanding that, again, energy never dies, and the music and the culture has been documented. It is here, and it is still living on in creative people today, right? It is happening. I think sometimes what we're being force-fed is devoid of spirit in some ways. You know what I mean? It's trying to make you remove yourself from that part of yourself. Such a world out there of music that feeds me spiritually that's out right now. But then there's also all of this legacy of music that's been left behind by our ancestors. And, that is one thing that did translate, right? You hear all kinds of kids, oh, my ancestors, people still alive. My ancestors, I'm like, that's not your ancestor, baby. That's not how that word works. But I understand what you're talking about. You're talking about this connection to generations before you, which I will never try and take away from somebody. But yeah, I mean, I think every time for me, putting on a record does that for me. I put on a record and I feel connected. I can hear that person breathing on that record. They are alive in that moment in my memory. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think that's powerful, you know. Not just whose record it was, because in some cases it's people who were very dear to me who are no longer with me, or it's people I've spoken to, like Otis Clay. Dear man, I mean, really beautiful being, really beautiful person. And so when I hear his records, I think about him. Oh, darn it.
No, I was last week, I was in a lounge listening to music with another one of my favorite DJs in the city, DJ Cash Era. And we were in there, it was a good night, and the music sort of fades, and then all of a sudden it was just like, order my steps in your word. And I was like, first I looked up at it, and I was like, what is happening right now? But I let myself sit in that right before it started to like sort of be cut in, like what it is, what's up, right? It was a very interesting fusion. But in that moment, as the song was playing, like what came alive inside of me, and like the people who came back, and the moments who came back, and like I could sit there and think of Mr. Carter, like sort of sectioning us out, and then like you're a soprano and you're an alto. And this is the part you're gonna do, and this is the part you're gonna do, and like that ability, the ability for the music to transport you. I used the term time travel earlier. What my grandmother's home was, but in many ways, so many of these records do the same thing, both taking me to a time that I vividly remember, but also taking me to a time that I only remember through their storytelling. And it's, by the time it was being faded out, I had been taken to some place in that night that I had never expected, but was always open to. And it's something that I appreciate about your sets. I've sat there at Bronzeville Winery and other places as you play. And if you just come open to who you are, to your own traditions, to your own like lineage of music, you're going to be transported to many places that night. And so I wonder, sitting in your lap, what are some of the sort of portals that you have in front of you that you're excited to play later?
Well, the real goal of the 45 is right here, right?
Okay.
But the albums, I have these just because they are kind of historical talismans, so to speak. So like this one on top is pretty interesting. It is the People's Choir of Operation Push. Here they are right here. You might know this church on Drexel that is pictured here.
Shout out to Ashley Jackson.
There you go, all of that. Under the direction of Reverend Marvin Yancey, rest in peace, who, Chuck Jackson, Marvin Yancey, later on did loads of big hits, most notably for Natalie Cole, right? Which is pretty interesting. But when you look at who's who on this record, and it was on Stax, by the way, out of Memphis, Tennessee, it's pretty interesting. And then again, this was the Black, Brown, and Beige. This is a great one, actually. This is The Last Request, Ben Branch and the Operation Breadbasket Orchestra and Choir. You might notice a trend here in some of the things, the political leanings of some of these recordings. This is really interesting because it was recorded right after Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And the last request was to hear Precious Lord Take My Hand that he had in Memphis, Tennessee before he was killed. This was recorded here in Chicago, April 17th and 18th of 1968. Yeah, I'm going to play this and it's a transformational record. This is another one. This is a group called the Spencer Jackson Family. A little in the weeds, but they're great. They're great. They did a lot of stuff with the Pharaohs, who wound up playing Phoenix horns and Earth, Wind, and Fire, et cetera, et cetera. But at this time, you've got Stanley Keeble on organ, you've got Phil Coran on francophone, and it's just a great record. It's just a whole bunch of stuff. Salem Travelers, getting back on the stuff people know. This has a couple of good things on here, but it's cool because in the liner notes it talks about Chicago as a city famous for its gospel quartets, the Soul Stirrers, the Highway QCs, the Pilgrim Jubilees, the Norfleet Brothers. the Gospel Paraders. In only a few years' time, the Soulful Salem Travelers have joined the ranks of these quartet champions. And it just really goes into that history that I think is really notable, and also ties it and says, in this album, the group offers several other tunes sure to delight any fans of the Temptations, or Chess's great soul quartet, the Dells. This was on Checker, which was a Chess subsidiary, Chess being a label out of Chicago. So all of them have really cool stories, I think. This is Milton Brunson and the Thompson Community Singers. We're doing real deep in the Chicago music here. And it was recorded at PS Studios, which was Paul Serrano's studio in Chicago, which no longer is here, but it was where a lot of Earth, Wind, Fire, Free by Denise Williams was recorded there. The Emotions, a lot of their recordings were recorded there. And they also recorded Milton Brunson. You know what I'm saying? So I think that's kind of the point. I think there's just like a lot of overlap, which I think is pretty cool. So
Yeah.
that's kind of my little thing. I love that they had like these side versions of themselves simultaneously a lot.
I love that when you dive behind a name, like I think about the Caravans from Albertina Walker, you know, the godmother of gospel after Mahalia Jackson.
That's in the 45s.
Right, you look into those, the people who come out of the Caravans, the Dorothy Norwoods, the Shirley Caesars, the Inez Andrews, the
That's in there
Dolores
too.
Washington.
All that stuff is in there.
All of that is in the 45.
It's in the 45s.
I really appreciate how you can see just this, like this passing down, not of just the torch, but like so many of these gospel legends like really facilitated a space where so many people can not only cut their teeth in gospel music, but could go on and have such like broad careers in soul and R&B music. But again,
And go back and forth and do this
that's
and
what
do
I was
that.
gonna say, but kept the door open. And again, it's a way that the legacies of these black musics are inextricably linked to gospel, to jazz, to blues. You know, I feel like after such a long conversation, it feels like a simple question, but if you remove, or could you remove gospel music from Chicago history and end up with still a city that has produced so much cool, so much groundbreaking, particularly as we think about the contributions of Black Chicago to like sort of just what have just become sort of like synonymous parts of like the Black experience, but they are founded here in Black Chicago. Like if you remove gospel music, is that history allowed to be as rich, as deep?
I mean,
It's hyperbole.
That's super hyperbole. But what I will say is Chicago is especially Black Chicago, is such a deeply spiritual place. You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, we haven't even talked about other spiritual traditions in the Black community that have left their mark on this city. But I would say that what is the earmark of the music and the culture is that spiritually rooted thing that we have. And also, I don't want to create this false narrative that young people are not embracing of older things and traditions, because I live in another city now most of the time, boo, but I do. And in that other city, I've recognized, in other cities I've been to, I recognize that the younger people really have a lack of understanding of previous generations. I think a lot of our elders have poured into us, and especially creative people. We drink from that well so deeply over and over and over again. And I've heard elders say the same thing. I just couldn't take spirituality out of that mix in terms of what it is that we're contributing.
Well, this has been a really fantastic conversation. I'm grateful that you joined us today. I appreciate everyone who made it possible for us to be here and to have it. But I thank you all so much for being here today and for listening.